Good afternoon, everybody. It is Wednesday, March 24th, 2021, and it's 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which means it is time for Women in Business. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. There's no guest, there's just me. And I'm going to talk about some ideas that I've been working on that may become a book, which are kind of based on some things I've learned over the years of dealing with what I call my damage. And if you're wondering what this has to do with women in business, let's start with the first principle, which is basically everyone has damage. Everybody's got something that happened in their life that was a negative. I mean, I would imagine there are very few people who don't have some kind of damage in their life. And so what that means is that everybody's dealing with things that may be stopping them from success, that may be stopping them from starting a business, that may be stopping them from believing in themselves, that may be stopping them from doing any number of things. Who knows what those might be. So what happens, and why this ties in with women in business, is that while you're also running a business and starting a family and trying to find a partner and doing all that sort of stuff, you're also dealing with whatever damage you may be carrying along with you. And that means that you're battling whatever issues you might have that your damage is causing. Now, in my case, I'll give you an example. My brain has been trying to convince me all day today that I did not need to do this video, that nobody was going to watch it, nobody was going to care, nobody cared what I had to say, it didn't matter. And because I have a lot of experience in dealing with my own personal damage, I know that generally when my brain starts really talking to me about why I shouldn't do something, or why it doesn't need to happen, or nobody's going to care, that's usually a sign that, yes, I really do need to do that thing, because whatever it is scaring me enough and is scaring my brain enough that my brain is trying to convince me that I want to do something other than what I want to do, than what I plan to do. So it's usually a good indication that I should go forward with whatever I'm planning. Now, let's contrast that with, you have gut instincts that tell you this person might be dangerous, or this person is maybe somebody you don't want to deal with. Those you should listen to. So you have to learn to know the difference. And part of dealing with your damage and finding the positive in whatever damage has happened to you is that you learn to know the difference between gut instinct and when maybe you're scared of something and you're giving yourself excuses so you don't have to do it. And that's basically what today is. This is kind of a topic for me that is, how do I want to put this the right way? That is kind of a scary one. And it's scary to put yourself out there and say, hey, I have these concepts and I'm thinking about writing a book. And I think that I have enough to say, and what I have to say is valid enough that I should write a book and that people should pay money and buy it and learn from it. So there's a lot of scary things in that sentence that I just said. And the part of it that's interesting is, because I know that everyone has damage, and because I am intimately familiar with my particular damage, I know when my brain is trying to protect me from something that maybe I don't need to be protected from. So part of knowing that everyone has damage is understanding that everyone is learning to manage their damage in different ways, and they may be at different levels and different places in learning to manage their damage. So understanding how you're damaged is a powerful tool, because and I want to go to one thing. I'm going to say damage a lot in this hour. And that's because I think that's what it is. And I don't think that has to be a bad thing. I think it's only a bad thing if you allow it to be a bad thing. Everybody's got their bruises. Everybody's got their sore places. Everybody's got their scars. We're all damaged in some way. We're all kind of screwed up. And you can call it screwed up. You can call it damaged. You can call it, adult child of alcoholics, or you can call it whatever you want, victims or survivors, or, I mean, you can give it whatever name you want to give it. For me, damage is just descriptive. I have scars and sore places and hurt places, and I have coping mechanisms that maybe aren't the best coping mechanisms anymore. Witness my brain going, you don't need to do this. This has nothing to do with you. Or, this is not something that anybody's going to want to see or know. And the reason my brain is doing that is because, number one, those are fears that I have. And number two, it's trying to keep me from something that it experiences as scary, which is being vulnerable, which is going out there and saying, this is the damage I have in my life. And so I'm going to share that with you. And I'm going to tell you why I think that's meaningful. And that's a scary prospect. So, it's one of those things. Good afternoon, Cindy. Thank you for being here. That's one of those things that you really need to understand. Everybody's got damage at some level. I would guess there's virtually no one in the world that has skated through life without any negative experiences, without any scars, without any hurt places. I just don't see that happening. But that said, when you're talking about other people's damage, or when you're dealing with your own, whoops, I lost my, see, I'm good at this, yay. You need to have a no judgment zone. And one of the things that I really dislike when people talk about experiences they've had is there seems to be a certain cohort of people that feel like they have the right to put your injury on a scale and say, well, this is worse, or this is better, or that wasn't really that important. I don't know why you're talking about it, or whatever it is. And I call it, on occasion, I've called it in past talks that I've done, the Tragedy Olympics. And basically, the goal of the Tragedy Olympics is to give somebody a gold medal for having the worst story. And the way that you do that is you tell everybody's story and you rank them all on a scale of this is better, this is worse, whatever it is. So what happens is it's all about the comparisons, and somebody sitting in judgment and saying, you weren't hurt that badly, or you were hurt worse, or whatever it was. And the point of this is, number one, you're just staying in the place of the hurt, because all you're doing is comparing. You're not trying to learn from it. You're not trying to get better. You're not trying to make any sense of it or find the lesson or do anything. You're just holding it up to the light and going, well, this looks worse than this, so therefore you win. The thing is, you can't judge anybody else's pain. People like to do that. Like I said, it's the Tragedy Olympics. And they play it like there's some kind of medal for if you hurt yourself the worst, or if you were hurt the worst, or if your story is the worst. But the thing is, you can't quantify somebody else's pain. You can't make judgments about how much someone was hurt, or how that hurt manifested, or even what they should do about how they were hurt. It's not your place to do that. And it's not your place to judge your own pain either, really. I mean, I did that for a long time. Before I started talking about some of this stuff, there was a part of me that had listened to people that said, I'd say, well, I was emotionally abused. And people would say, well, at least you didn't get hit. And I'd be like, well, yeah, that's true. I never did get hit. So maybe it's not as bad as it felt like it was. And maybe there isn't as much damage as I thought there was. And the thing is, the only one who can determine how damaged or not damaged an experience leaves me is me. And the only one who can make sense of what the events in my life have done to me or not done to me, and what they mean to me, and what the lessons are, and what the good is in them, is me. And that, I mean, that's not to say that therapy can't be helpful. That's not to say that talking to someone who's trained to understand how damage manifests itself and how coping mechanisms work and all that sort of thing can't be helpful. It really can. And it really can be something that you can walk away from and learn a lot from. So, hi, Kylene. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. So one of the first things is really remember that no one has the right to judge you, and you don't have the right to judge anybody. People handle their damaged parts the way that they can at that time. And hopefully, as you learn and grow and understand more about your particular damage, then you'll also understand how to manage it better. So it becomes a sort of learning experience, and it becomes a sort of class for yourself. And I'm not going to lie, it's a long-term thing. It takes time to pick through all the pieces of what happened to you, figure out what it all meant, figure out how you learn to cope with it, and maybe what doesn't serve you anymore in that way. And figuring all this out is one of those things that you're going to have to spend some time doing. And I ain't going to lie, it's not all going to be fun. And one of the things that can be a problem is that people will also make judgments about how long healing and how long learning should take you. You should be over this by now. How come you haven't forgiven that? How come you haven't let that go, or whatever it is? And the thing with this is it takes however long it takes. It takes however long you need it to take. Your journey is your journey. Nobody has the right to judge the length of that journey. Nobody has the right to judge how sad that journey makes you or how angry that journey makes you. And you don't have the right to judge anybody else. And I think when we get away from the judgment and we just accept that everybody has their damage, they're all dealing with it in different ways, and we may not always agree with the way that someone is managing their damage, but as long as they're not hurting themselves or anyone else, it's not our place to say, you're doing that wrong. Because there is no wrong. There's just things that we do. And since I'm going to be talking a lot today, there's going to be some water breaks. Sorry, guys. But when I talk a lot, throat gets dry. So having said that there's that it should be a no judgment zone. You shouldn't judge other people. You also shouldn't necessarily judge yourself. What you should do is acknowledge that you had damage and then let it go. And let it go doesn't mean minimize it. And let it go doesn't mean ignoring it or being all Pollyanna about it and just kind of going, everything's great and everything's marvelous and I'm really happy and, whatever happened to me happened, and it's acknowledging it. It's, yes, I'm sad, or yes, I was hurt, or yes, this was wrong, or yes, I'm owed an apology, or whatever the particular thing that you think is. But once you've acknowledged that, and once you've worked through the pieces of it, and once you understand what your damage is and how it manifests itself and how you can alleviate the parts of it that maybe aren't serving you, how that manifestation isn't serving you as well as it should, and maybe the parts that you need to get rid of or take away, then you need to just say, okay, this happened, I understand it, and now I'm releasing it and I'm letting it go. Because the one thing that happens for some people is they get to the acknowledge stage, and then it kind of becomes like Gollum in Lord of the Rings. It's my precious. I'm going to cradle this piece of damage, whatever it is, and I'm going to just think about it all the time, and I'm going to look at all the ramifications, and I'm going to present it to everyone I know and tell them how this happened to me and how it impacts my life, and how if you do something completely unrelated, but it touches on a particular part of my particular damage, then I need you to respond to that and to do something about that and to, at base level, care about that. And the thing is, if you're holding your damage like it's your precious, if you're clutching it to your chest and you're just mulling over it all the time, then you're never moving beyond it. And you're never figuring out what the good was in what happened. And you're not letting go of the negative parts. Now, it sounds kind of easy. It's not. Sometimes even getting to the place where you can say, yes, I was damaged in some way, is really hard to do, because sometimes it's really hard to admit, particularly in situations where maybe you knew that something might happen and you still went forward, or in situations where maybe the damage was something that you caused because you weren't able to take an action that you needed to take or whatever. It's really hard sometimes to look at that and go, yep, that happened and it hurt and I'm sad about it and I'm angry about it and it wasn't fair and it wasn't right, but I can't hold on to it. I can't make this the guiding principle of the rest of my life. When I was young and going through some stuff, one of the things I used to tell myself a lot is they're not going to win. And it sounds very melodramatic, and I will freely admit I'm still a little bit of a drama queen, and I was quite a drama queen when I was younger. But what I was thinking to myself was, I will get beyond this. I will get to a place where I can look at this and figure it out. Now, why I had that little thought in my head, why I had that voice in my head that was saying, you'll get beyond this and you're going to figure out what this all means and there's going to be a point to it at some point, I don't know. But the getting to, once I got to a place where I was no longer in the situations that were causing problems, then I did have to look at what happened, and I had to look at my role in what happened. I had to look at other people's role in what happened. I had to acknowledge that I was hurt, or I was sad, or I was angry. And I had to figure out how I was moving forward. And moving forward requires saying, yep, that happened. It sucked. Some of it was very painful. Some of it was very unfair. Some of it left me with scars or sore places or whatever it was, but I need to let it go. Because if you're clutching it to you, if you had a bad childhood and 40 years on, you're still referencing your bad childhood and how you can't do certain things because your daddy was mean to you or whatever it was, you got to get that fixed, because at some point you have to let it go, no matter what it was. Because if you don't, they do win. Whoever hurt you is keeping you from having the best life you could have. And that's not right. And that's not what you want to do. Now, I should say, as I'm talking about these principles, they aren't really in any sort of order yet. They're just kind of concepts that I'm playing with in the thoughts that eventually maybe this could become something that could help a lot of people. So if I bounce from one point to another a little bit, it's because I don't really know where they all fit yet. I'm just putting a bunch of concepts out there to say, hey, does this make sense? Is this useful? If you saw a book with this concept in it, would you buy it and read it? So that's basically what we're looking at. But the next thing I want to talk about, and I think this is an important one, and it's something that we don't necessarily have happen as much as we'd like, which is serve as a survival example. And I hate the word survival. I wish I could think of another word. I haven't come up with it yet. I'm trying. But the value of this is, if you've been through something and if you've come out the other side and you figured out how you were damaged and you figured out how to manage that damage and you figured out maybe what good things came out of that damage, it's so, so helpful for people who are still going through the process to see that there's others out there who have gone through similar things and have come out on the other side and had happy lives and are being productive members of society. And it sounds like a really simple thing, but in our culture, especially in America, I think, but in our culture in general as people, there's a tendency to not want to talk about stuff, particularly if things are uncomfortable. So people don't tell their stories and people don't necessarily make their stories available to a wide audience. Maybe you tell your story in a support group, or maybe you tell your story when you're to your friends, or maybe you talk to your family about it. But there aren't a lot of people that are out there going, I have depression, or I was abused as a child, or I was sexually abused, or I was raped, or whatever it is, and I'm still here and I made it through. And you can be a survival example even if you're still in the middle of your own journey. One of the other things I think that stops people from talking, one of the things that was in my head today was, well, you're still dealing with certain things. How can you put yourself out there and say, I know how to do this? Because I am still dealing with things is honestly the reason. I've made it through stuff. I'm still learning. I think everybody's learning. I think when you stop learning, you're dead. So you need to keep learning. But I don't think there's an end point where I'm going to solve every problem I've ever had and figure out everything that's bothering me and dismantle all the coping mechanisms that I know don't serve me anymore, and I'm going to be a perfectly idealized human being. That's a lovely, lovely, lovely thought. But it's one of those things that you have to acknowledge that everybody's in process, everybody's on a journey, and you need to understand that you are further in your journey than other people. And if you can be an example for them of, hey, I walked through this crap you're walking through, and it doesn't have to be exactly the same crap, because everybody's crap, sadly, is unique. But if you can say, I've walked that path you're walking, maybe my path had purple speckled spots and your path had green dots, but we walked a similar path and I made it here and I'm doing well. And if I did it, you can do it. And I like these comments here. Thank you, Gusta. That means a lot. I really want that book. You are on a good track. Thank you. That means a lot. I appreciate it. And yes, Cindy, you're right too. Serve as a positive example. And that's really, and that actually might be a better than serve as a survival example, is be a positive example. And so thank you for that. But really what I'm looking at is let people know that there is a light at the end of their particular tunnel, that they can walk the path and get to a place where it doesn't hurt every day, that they can talk about the things that happen to them, and it can be a good experience, and it can be a positive experience, and it can be an experience that helps other people. Part of resolving my personal damage is doing stuff like this, is sitting here and saying, you know what, I went through a bunch of shit, some of it literally was shit. And I won't say I'm perfect. I still have a lot of things I need to work on. I'm fully aware of that. But I've made it further, honestly, than at times in my life I ever thought I would. I mean, when I was homeless and broken in the middle of a year-long depression and waking up daily and going, well, if I slit my wrist, would anybody notice? I never would have thought that I'd own my own house and have my own company and and run my own group and have my own show. And I never would have thought that. So I made it through that stuff, because every morning when I looked at the knives, I said, nope, not today. And maybe I did nothing else the rest of the day, but I made that decision. And then eventually I got help and I figured out a lot of things, and I'm here. Now, are there still things I need to work on? Oh, infinite number of things, sadly. But I am working on them. And it's one day at a time, and it's figuring out what piece of the puzzle I need to deal with today and dealing with it. It's also recognizing the coping mechanisms I still have in place that maybe aren't serving me well. There's a lot of things there's a lot of pieces to this. It's not a straight line. It's not necessarily a fast process. But if you can be an example for someone who is earlier in their path than you are, then you're providing them with hope and you're providing them with a little bit of light. And that can be a huge value. The next thing I want to talk about is what you do to you. And this is an interesting aspect of damage, because when you have damage, when you've been damaged, sometimes you don't really like yourself. A lot of times you don't really like yourself. And sometimes you think that it's your fault that you were damaged by whatever happened. And so you try to punish yourself and you try to make yourself feel pain or serve penance or whatever it is, because you think what happened to you, you deserved, or you caused, or you in some way manifested, whatever language you want to use. The problem with this is a lot of things happen in people's lives that are random. And one of the things that is really hard for our brains to deal with is the idea that crap just randomly happens. I have a friend who lives in Boulder, and there was a shooting at a supermarket. I'm sure you've all seen the news. You know this. And it's freaking him right the heck out, because he's been to that store. He shopped in that store. He was actually scheduling a COVID vaccination when the shooting happened. So he could very well have scheduled a vaccination and been in that store when the shooter appeared and shot those 10 people. And the randomness of it is just blowing his mind, basically. And I think that happens for a lot of people. What the damage that's done to you is random. So you end up trying to make sense of it. And the way that you make sense of it is, I deserve this. I did something. I caused it. I'm a bad person. So then you decide in your brain, because you haven't really looked at the damage yet and acknowledged it and let it go and understood what it meant and how you were coping with it, you decide instead that you deserve punishment. You deserve penance. So you try to punish yourself. I was the queen of this for a lot of years. I punished myself in a lot of ways, in ways that I didn't even necessarily understand all the time, that what I was trying to do was punish myself. I thought I was coping. What I was really doing was trying to make myself pay for things that I didn't do to myself. So I was trying to pay a debt that I really didn't owe, but I didn't know that at that point. So one of the things, I like this comment from Kylene, so I'm going to throw this in here real quick. It's brave to talk about this, and I really love that you're sharing. We can control our response to a situation, create our story, and find joy again. You are amazing. Thank you. And continue to inspire others every day. I hope that's true. I hope that is true. Not the amazing part, but the inspiring others part. But you need to be aware that what you do to you is sometimes worse than what others did that caused the original damage, because a lot of people who cause damage, either purposely or not purposely, will tell you that they did it because of you, because you weren't good enough, because you didn't meet their needs, because you're just a waste of space, and oh my God, what are you even doing here, and whatever. And I'll give you an example of this, because this is one that stuck in my mind for a really long time. My father was not physically abusive, but he was emotionally abusive. And there was one instance where he cornered me in our family room in the basement, and he was standing in front of me, just screaming in my face. I don't even remember about what, but just yelling about what a worthless person I was and whatever it was that he thought I'd done and all this stuff. Now he's 6'2", I'm 5'4", and I was pretty terrified. So he finally let me go, backed off. I went upstairs, and in our house at the time, you go upstairs, you go into this little foyer area. There was a bathroom and the door to the garage, and then you go through another door and you were in the kitchen. My mother was in the kitchen. So I walked through the door of the kitchen, and I'm crying and obviously distressed. And she looked at me and she said, if you just behave better, he wouldn't have to do that. And I went, and even in my head, the cognitive dissonance was just so, I was like, I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything to warrant that. I didn't do anything to cause that. It wasn't me. But the message I was getting was, if you were different, you could control what he's doing, and then he wouldn't do that, and then it would all be better. So her damage and his damage were working to create damage in me. And then I believed that somehow I had done this and I deserved to be punished. And that's really sad. But one of the things you have to pay attention to is, what choices are you making? What are you doing to you? And if you figure that out, then you can also figure out how to stop hurting yourself. Because one of the saddest things is when you've been damaged and then you turn around and hurt yourself more because you're not dealing with the damage that's been done to you by other events. So there's definitely work that needs to be done there. And again, this is a puzzle. A lot of you people are garment decorators. So this is picking the stitches out of the embroidery that's where it's not supposed to be, or it's weeding the really intricate vinyl design that has, 5 million little places that you got to pull the vinyl out of. That's what this sort of thing is. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's not going to be It's not going to be fun, and it might even be painful, but that's something that needs to happen. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is being motivated, not mastered. And what I mean by this is, when you have damage, when you've been damaged, you need to let it motivate you to get better, not master you to the point where you're a slave to whatever damage you have. And you're always thinking about it. Again, we're back to the my precious thing, where you're always thinking about it and you kind of just give into it, and you don't work to figure out what the good is in it. You don't work to figure out how it manifests itself in you. You don't work to figure out what coping mechanisms you've been using to mitigate the damage or to make yourself feel better or whatever it is. You're just relaxed back in the dead man's float, and you're just going to let the current take you wherever it takes you. So what you need to do when you have damage is be motivated to manage it, to figure out what it means in your life, what the good is, what the bad is, let the bad go, and use the good to make your life better. Damage is a weird thing because you can end up in kind of a perpetual cycle where you think you're changing and making strides, but really you're just kind of running on a treadmill because you keep coming back to the same place. So you need to be motivated to try new things, to create new habits, to speak about how you're damaged in a different way, to reach out to people who can help you figure out pieces of how you're damaged and what you should do about it. Nobody has all the answers for their own life. It's a lovely thing to think that I'm the captain of my ship and I'm the master of my soul and I know how if you've been through anything in your life, if you've had any kind of negative incident that left you feeling less than or worthless or sad or angry or whatever it is, you may need to go talk to somebody, or you may need to find a group, and it could be a group online, it could be a group in person, whatever it is. But you need to be motivated to make the changes that you need to make to have the kind of life you want to have. And the thing that also needs to be very clear about this, and it's a trap I've fallen into oh, so many times when I was in my early 20s and dating regularly is, if there was a guy out there that was messed up, I was going to latch onto him because I was going to love him enough that he was going to change. You can't change someone else. You can't motivate someone else. There are people who are living in the midst of their damage and they're creating havoc and they're hurting themselves, and you know it, and it's horrible, but you can't make them be different. You can talk to them, you can support them, you can love them, but you can't make them be different. I don't like the word angels, but really that's what it was. I had people in different places in my life that showed up and told me things that I needed to know. And they were things that actually really helped me and really set me on a different path, or showed me a portion of my damage that really was not serving me well, and that I needed to acknowledge it and let it go and figure out how to cope in a better way. But until I was motivated to make those changes, you could talk to me about it all day. You could talk to me about it for years, and I wasn't going to make the change. And that's, I think, one of the hardest things to learn about ourselves and about other people is you can't make someone else do it. And sometimes you can't even make yourself do it until you're ready. And that's a hard thing, because you feel like I understand all the reasons why this is a good thing and I should do it, but I'm not ready to do it yet. I'm not there yet. And sometimes you just have to, again, acknowledge and let it go. Okay, I know what I need to do, but I'm not emotionally ready. I'm not financially ready. I'm not physically ready, whatever it is. So I'm going to have to put a pin in this one until I get to a place where I can do things properly, where I can do things in a way that I'm going to have the best outcome. So motivation has to come, and you want to be motivated, not mastered. You want to be motivated to make changes and deal with your damage in the most positive way. You don't want your damage to master you and to take over your life. Now, this is one that also comes up in the Jack Canfield stuff. It's another way, basically, of saying 100% responsibility. Where the responsibility lies for your damage is a different thing than where the responsibility lies for what you do about your damage. Now, it sounds silly and people are like, okay, yeah, well, this is like a no-brainer, but it's really not. Because like I said, there are a lot of people who are stuck in the punishment phase where they think they caused whatever happened. They wore a short skirt and went to the wrong bar, and they got assaulted, and so that's their fault. Or maybe if they really had been a different sort of person, then they would have been able to act in a different way. And so their father wouldn't have had to yell at them, or whatever it is. And I mean, the examples can be anything. When people hurt you, they're responsible for that. When people systematically cause you pain or denigrate you or put you down, or or even something as simple as just making fun of your ideas or not listening to you or whatever it is, the responsibility for that is theirs. They made the choice. They decided that they were going to do that particular thing. So the responsibility for that is on them. And you can make the case that anybody who's causing damage probably has damage of their own, and they may be reacting to that. And yes, that's very true. But the caveat to this is everybody is responsible for fixing their own damage. And if you can't acknowledge it, if you won't take responsibility for it, then if you damage someone else, that responsibility is yours. You may not like that. And I mean, I have to say this is one that I struggled with a little bit, because for a long time, when it came to people who had caused damage in my life, I would always give them an out. I would say, well, they had a drinking problem, or, well, they had mental illness issues, or, they had, and I was I thought what I was doing was forgiving, but I really wasn't. I was more excusing, because you can acknowledge that somebody has issues and still forgive them for the damage they caused because of those issues. But if you're just saying, well, they wouldn't have done it if they weren't this thing, if they weren't drinking, if they didn't have this issue. And you may be totally right, but that doesn't really matter, because the responsibility for managing their issues and managing their damage is on them. And if they allow their damage to harm you, then the responsibility for that is on them. And this is a tough one for a lot of people, because the other side of the coin is the damage that you do to someone else is on you. If you don't figure out how to manage your own scars and pain and damage, and handle it in the best way, and dismantle the coping mechanisms that aren't working for you anymore, and be aware of how you impact other people and what you're putting out in the world, then if you hurt somebody else, that responsibility is yours. And that's a tough one, because if we're all taking responsibility for our impact on other people and the world, then you can end up in a situation where inadvertently you do cause damage to someone, and then you have to acknowledge it and admit it and make amends for it. And I think that's why part of a lot of the 12-step programs, there's always a step that is making amends, going to people or writing them a letter or calling them on the phone or sending them an email or whatever it is, and saying, I'm sorry I hurt you. I didn't mean to do that. And you also have to add in a little bit of, you can't judge either, because people will come to you and say, you caused damage, and in your mind you're going, really? That was a thing? And it's not really your place to say whether it was a thing or not. Now, I mean, you have certainly the right to say, I didn't intend to cause any damage. I'm sorry that I did. And I think the big thing here is, if someone comes to you and says, you caused damage, you need to acknowledge that they believe the damage was caused. Now, that's not the same thing as necessarily saying, yeah, I did. It's just saying, I understand that this is how you perceive this. Here's where I'm coming from. But I have to say, the hardest thing, and one of the things that is hardest to let go of, is when someone causes damage and they never acknowledge it or say that they did or apologize. But again, that's kind of one of those things where you have to acknowledge that it happened and let it go, because you can't really do anything else. So it's one of those things where responsibility is a double-edged sword, because yes, the people who did damage to you were responsible for doing that damage, but you're also responsible for how you manage the damage that was done to you and how you manifest the damage that was done to you. And it's not easy. I have done things in my life where, as a result of damage that was done to me, I was trying to punish myself. I was trying to hurt myself. I was trying to, where I just really screwed up or I was avoiding things because I didn't want to deal with stuff, because that was my coping mechanism for a long time, is when things got conflicted or hard, I ran away. And I made a mess, and I've blown up my life on a couple of occasions, not on purpose, but because of circumstances and because I had damage. And it's tough to stand in the middle of that and go, yep, I did it. It was all me. And just leave it at that and not go, but I had this in my childhood, and but I was teased, and but this or but that, or, it's just to go, yep, whatever happened to me, I'm an adult now. It's my responsibility to manage my damage. And if I don't manage it well, then I have to accept the responsibility for the consequences. Not necessarily fun, but pretty important. And I think this is another thing that we need to look at in a slightly different way than maybe most people talk about it. Freedom equals forgive, not forget. And people look at forgiveness and they want to make it this totally like get out of jail free card. If you forgive someone, you wipe the slate clean and everything is marvelous and sunny and you're all skipping down the primrose path together. Here's the thing about that. I don't think that's how it should work, and I don't think that's how it does work. There are a lot of people in my life that created damage for one reason or another. I've forgiven them. I don't hate them. I don't wish them ill. Some of them I don't necessarily want to hang around, but I don't feel any negative feelings toward them. At most, I'm neutral. I accept that they were dealing with whatever damage they had, and this is how it manifested. And in the process, I got hurt. I accept that in some cases, they probably didn't mean necessarily to hurt me. It just happened. I accept that it's not fair, and I forgive that. I forgive the universe, I guess, because I don't really think there's anybody out there that's actually arbitrating fairness or not fair. But, I forgive life, I guess, for not always being fair and not always being fun, and for the fact that I went through some stuff that I really would have been okay not going through. I forgive the people who said inane things to me like, God never gives you more than you can handle. Or, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And Carolyn sent me a cartoon that I still really would like to find a lithograph of or something, because I'd hang it up, that said, I'm really tired of things making me stronger and not killing me, or whatever it was. And I'm like, yeah, I've been in that position. So you have to forgive all that stuff. And once you forgive and let it go, then you're free, because your damage isn't holding you back, and your damage isn't hanging off you like some kind of, bells that are always ringing and making you remember. You've let it go. You're not holding out for an apology. You're not holding out for an explanation. You've accepted it. You've absolved the people who hurt you. You've made a decision as to whether you want those people in your life or not anymore, and you've moved on. You're working at building your best life, and they're doing whatever they're doing. The thing about this is, forgiveness doesn't have to equal forgetting. If somebody hurts you and you forgive them and they're still in your life, you need to remember what happened, and you need to remember the signs of problems, and you need to remember how they made you feel at various points in your life. And you need to remember all that so you can make an informed decision on whether or not those people need to stay in your life. And one of the things that I really dislike, I guess, is how I'm going to phrase it, is the whole concept of family is everything and family is forever. And I'm like, well, what if your family really hurt you? Or what if they never supported you? Or what if you don't particularly like the person that you are when you're with your family? Why is it different if the people that are hurting you are the people that are related to you? Why is that different than a random stranger? Why? I don't understand that. And that's something that I'm still working to figure out, because I think sometimes your family can hurt you worse than anybody else. And but the message that we get from our culture and from people that we talk to is that family's different and family should get a pass that other people don't get. And I don't necessarily understand that. I do believe forgive. I think you should forgive people who hurt you. I think you need to try to understand why it happened and what their damage was that might have caused that to happen. And then accept that they were doing the best they could at that particular time, which may not have been very good, and forgive it, but don't forget it. Because if you forget it, you're kind of negating what happened. You're kind of saying that doesn't matter. And you also could potentially be setting yourself up for further damage in the future. And who needs that? So be aware. Don't hold it against anybody, because that just holds you back. If you have a grudge, if you're constantly looking for acknowledgement or apologies or explanations, then you're just going to be in the same old cycle, and you need to move on from that. So let it go. And forgiving is one way of letting go. And forgiving can be writing a letter. It can be saying, I forgive you. It can be just mentally doing it in your head. It can be, doing an exercise where you sit in a chair and you put the person you need to forgive in the other chair and you tell them all the stuff you need to tell them. However you need to do it. Doesn't really matter how it happens. It's just something that you need to go through, and you need to make a decision to say, there's an affirmation, and I'm not a huge fan of affirmations, but I kind of like this one that says, say the name of the person and say, I forgive you and I release you. And I kind of like that sort of, because I think that's the goal of forgiveness. Forgiveness is actually releasing yourself from the chains of being bound to this person who damaged you. You're saying, I acknowledge the damage happened. I acknowledge your part in it. I'm accepting it, and I'm letting you go. And I'm letting my need to have any more closure for this go. And, like I said, forgiveness is a process, and however you need to do it is however you need to do it. But the important part is you can forgive the person, but don't forget what they did, because you may need to be aware of that. And the last thing I want to talk about, because gosh, I've been prattling on for a while here, is boundaries, not barriers. And this is a big one for me. And what I mean by this is that when you're learning to deal with your damage, you're going to also have to learn to set boundaries, to decide what's acceptable to you and what's not. Because a lot of people who have been involved in situations that cause damage never really learned to set boundaries. Either they weren't allowed to, or they just never were taught how you should do that. So what happens is you don't understand how to say, this is acceptable to me, this is not acceptable to me. And because you're damaged, you may, especially in the beginning when you're just learning to deal with your damage and how to set boundaries, you may let things that happen to you become barriers, because you're so afraid of having this experience again that instead of setting good boundaries to make sure that doesn't happen, you just let the experience cut you off from something that could potentially be a really good experience. And that's something that I'm intimately familiar with, particularly in the area of romantic relationships. I'm not good at them, and I'm not comfortable with them a lot of the time. And what happens is I get scared and I run. And that's a barrier. It's not about, instead of saying, I trust myself enough to know that if I get in a relationship that isn't a good one, I'm going to have the proper boundaries to say, this isn't working for me. I need this not to happen anymore. I need to not be in this situation. I just put up a barrier and keep everybody on the other side of it. Not the best way to manage things, but it's something that I'm still in the process of dismantling, because trust is very hard for me, particularly trust in romantic situations. So what I have to learn is, what are my boundaries in these situations? And then I have the right to set boundaries in these situations. And then I have the right to enforce my boundaries in these situations. And then I have to trust that I'm smart enough now to pick people who will recognize and respect my boundaries. And therefore I'm safe and I can take a chance and see what happens. So there's a lot of things that go into this, but when you're learning how to set boundaries, when you've had experiences with people who don't respect boundaries, it's sometimes really tough to believe in boundaries, and it's almost easier to just set up a barrier to say, this happened and therefore I'm never going to experience that particular thing again, or I'm going to be very wary, or I'm going to have one foot out the door because I know it's going to go south at some point. So you have to be aware of setting boundaries, not barriers. And that's a tough one. It's really hard, particularly in areas where you're fearful or where you have an extreme amount of damage. Sometimes it's really hard to say, I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to trust that I know enough now and I understand enough about what's happened to me and about other people that I can set a boundary and enforce it. And, you know, unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there who don't respect boundaries. And it's a tough thing sometimes, because you can invest a lot of time and energy into a relationship and then realize that your boundaries aren't being respected and you can't continue that. And that's very difficult. But at the same time, at least you tried. And if you have barriers, you're not trying at all. You're just putting up a roadblock and saying, I don't trust this, I'm not going to do it. So boundaries that you enforce, boundaries that you require other people to respect, and boundaries that you understand why they're there. And if you do that and respect your own boundaries, respect yourself enough to have boundaries, and acknowledge that boundaries are what's going to keep you safe, not barriers. Because barriers don't keep you safe, barriers just keep you isolated. And isolation, as we all know from this past year, is not the best thing in the world. So anyway, those are the concepts I wanted to put out there today. As I said, still, you know, there's a lot of work still to be done on this, but I was kind of inspired by talking to Kylene last week about, you know, if you have an idea, you need to put it out there and see what people think and if it resonates and if there's any value to it. And so I figured I would put this out here and see what y'all thought, and if it did have any resonance for anyone, and if they found it interesting, and we'll go from there. I don't know, I should say, I'm not sure next week if there will be a Women in Business or not. I'm doing my DAX seminar earlier in the day, and that may be all the talking I want to do for that particular Wednesday. So we'll see. That may be, it may be a pop-up Women in Business next Wednesday. We'll see how that goes. And speaking of DAX seminars, if you want to check out the DAX seminars, go to daxshow.com and click on the big blue button, and you can see all the seminars that are available. The cost is very reasonable. I'd certainly love for you to attend mine. I think obviously that it's going to be worthwhile. And if you're at all nervous or uncertain about how to handle social media, I think it can be very helpful to you. So thank you all for listening today. I appreciate the comments. That went really fast. So if nothing else, I can talk about this subject for an hour. So yay. And I'll see you all soon. Thank you very much for being here. Bye.